to share my screen. So give me a second here. Oops, sorry, I see my text. Okay. Now I'm going to hide myself. There we go. All right. Welcome, everyone, all people today. We're so excited to be here. Please put something in the chat if you're having any challenges hearing me so that I am aware of that, or if you cannot see the screen. We're going to jump right in. Our topic today is arts access is an aesthetic. On the first screen here, you see our Arts Possible Ohio logo. It says Art Possible Ohio, making creativity accessible. And our logo has a little white P made out of arrows within a purple circle, and then kind of a pinkish orange circle around that. Come on, advance. Our mission at Art Possible Ohio, we are the statewide service organization on the arts and disability. We work with artists of all ages who have disabilities to make arts and cultural experiences more accessible and inclusive. Together, we make art possible, hence our name. This is the mission of Arts Possible Ohio. We do this mission through lots of free public-facing programs that are either professional development opportunities for artists with disabilities, cultural access work, which is professional development for cultural organizations like today. Also, we have a teaching artists in schools program that works in Ohio's K through 12 system in classrooms that work with students with disabilities. And then we have some programs like Real Abilities, which is our annual film festival that is a film festival dedicated to normalizing disability. And our Accessible Expressions Ohio exhibition, which is our annual statewide exhibition featuring artwork by artists with disabilities. If you want to learn more about any of these programs, you can contact us. We'll have our info on how to contact us at the end of today's presentation, or you can go to our website at www.artpossibleohio.org. So let's introduce ourselves. Miss Molly, you want to go ahead?
Sure thing. My name is Molly Kearney. There is an image of me on the left side of the screen. I have reddish brown hair. I am a Caucasian woman. In the picture, I am smiling and wearing a blue dress with embroidered flowers and sheer sleeves, and I'm sitting outside. I will make a note that Megan and I try our best to visually describe what is on the screen. It's one of those accessibility best practices so that people who have low sight or who are blind also can experience the visuals through our word pictures that we paint. And Megan will talk a little bit about that later too, about some best practices for that. My background is in museums and in cultural organizations. I started out at the Ohio History Connection a bunch of years ago, and then the Columbus Museum of Art. And then in 2019, I came to what was then VSA Ohio, but is now Art Possible Ohio. And I'm also a working artist. So I have sort of a special place in my heart for the arts and for artists who may not fit what our typical experience is of an artist when we visit a museum. So we like to see all types of people represented on our museum walls. And Megan.
Thanks, Molly. So my picture is on the right hand of the screen. I'm a white woman with short, curly brown hair. I'm sitting outside in front of a tree, kind of holding my phone in front of me to snap the shot. Wearing a gray tank top and big sunglasses. Also, as far as visual descriptions go, I have put descriptions in the PowerPoint too. So a screen reader would pick up on any of the images that are in the screen today. And if you have the latest PowerPoint, just a hot tip, it should prompt you to actually include image descriptions, but if not, you can look up how to include them in your own PowerPoints for folks who need them. Today's presentation. So a large chunk of the work that Art Possible Ohio does is promoting access for folks with disabilities in cultural spaces. Today, we're going to kind of take it a bit further. We know a lot of you are already doing this work, and we're going to discuss the following: art spaces and disability, intersectionality, what it means to show up. And then we're going to give you some practical ideas in learning, the learning departments of your organizations, exhibitions, if you offer those. You can think performance if that suits you better, human resources, facilities, marketing, and development. I'm going to kind of do the back end of things first, those first 3 points up there, and then Molly's going to take it over after me. On the screen today, you'll see all the words that I just listed, but then also we have an image that is really a reflection of, it's supposed to symbolize intersectionality. So there's a blue circle with a little person icon in the center, and then multicolored arrows pointing out at different words: ethnicity, gender, age, sexuality, disability, culture, class, and religion. We do ask that you hold questions till the end of each of our segments. If you have something really pressing, feel free to throw it in the chat box. Molly might be able to address it, or she'll interrupt me if needed. But we'll definitely leave time at the end for Q&A. And here we go. So the reason that we are doing this presentation is because we believe, and I'm sure that you do too, that art spaces have generally and historically reflected the mainstream values of our society. So you were welcome if you were white, had money, no visible disability. And generally, the historical objects, presentations, performances, and art reflect this as well. At least disability, as well as many other hidden histories, are not often explicitly represented in public-facing orgs, and often not in staff representation and visitor representation. So taking note of this, let's move on to discuss art spaces and their history with the disability movement. So if we're sticking to the mainstream, well-documented history, we truly don't really have a good one because you can't find it if you do a Google search. As mentioned, mainstream culture and placemaking has been rooted in the white supremacy culture and a reflection of the mainstream values that are out there. So in the US, before there was a significant shift in how people with disabilities were viewed, we know this, people were typically put into asylums if they had a disability, visible or not. There weren't things like ramps for wheelchair users. There certainly weren't restrooms or accessible parking. There wasn't space on public transportation for wheelchairs or any kind of mobility aid. Establishments could refuse to serve a person with disabilities, refuse them from buying goods. And if someone could actually get into a space, there were often navigation problems, aisles being too narrow, things being in the way, lots of steps that you couldn't get up, things like that. Homosexuality was considered to be a disability, and there was actually no previous legal definition of disability, and homosexuality was considered a disease until 1973. And then any place of employment could just refuse to hire somebody with a disability, or if they did hire them, they could legally pay them less than someone else who was doing the exact same job. As you know, we saw a shift. We've seen a shift over time in the last century. There were schools for the blind and deaf emerged that focused more on those specific disabilities. More humane institutions emerged for individuals with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, but they were still often segregated by color of person and still segregated overall in society. They were othered, pushed away. This space is not part of our mainstream space. And it's really only been in the last 20 years and more so in the last decade that we've seen a change of tide in the way individuals with disabilities have been treated, and a change in the access and a change in the culture. So if you try to look up information, you're only going to find recent articles about disability and cultural spaces and the changes that have happened, a lot more so even in the museum spaces. And a large part of this movement is in thanks to disability advocates, of course, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. But in large part, museums still reflect mainstream values of our society and the mainstream histories of our society, as well as other cultural orgs. The image up here is a New Yorker cartoon that I really like. It's of two individuals, kind of pen drawn or pencil drawn, sitting on a bench in front of a painting, an abstract painting, and there is a walking stick behind the bench, and they're talking to each other. And the caption underneath says, "I like this painting because it has a bench." So let's talk now about the Americans with Disabilities Act because it was significant. It was signed in 1990. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, basically just said as a general, no individual shall be discriminated against on the basis of disability and the full and equal enjoyment of goods, service, facilities, privileges, advantage, or accommodations in any public space. So whether you own that place or you were leasing that space. It did a lot of great things for individuals with disabilities. It talked a lot about building requirements, whether you were adapting them or doing a new build, what was required. You needed to have wider doors for wheelchairs and other mobility aids in your bathrooms, really in any entrance. You needed to have ramps, you needed to have accessible parking, bathrooms. It defined what a disability is, and it also required employers to make reasonable accommodation in their hiring practices. But let's talk also about what it didn't do and what it doesn't do. So the ADA doesn't really eliminate disability bias and prejudice in our culture. The majority of our cultural spaces were built to appease and cater to an able-bodied, elite, privileged, and white class of society. This just doesn't like change because a law came into place. And it also doesn't eliminate bias of visitors to these spaces, people without disabilities who are prejudiced and problematic also for access. The ADA doesn't give us perfect answers on how to make our spaces or programs or policies more accessible. It can be really overwhelming to consider accessibility in your space. We often don't know where to begin. Are we going to talk about the physical structure, program changes, internal policies, who's allowed to change those policies, how do we start? Hiring practices. It doesn't address the needs of every cultural space and their unique communities. We all live in our own unique communities and they all have different needs and different wants. And then of course, organizations, especially arts spaces, are limited by budgets and resources just like every other institution. The ADA does not like spew money at us to give us those resources that we need to make these important changes. I think the ADA doesn't necessarily make disability culture and history very visible. It doesn't normalize disability in museum work. And it doesn't require people to recruit individuals with disabilities, whether that be for your staff, your volunteers, board members, etc. I also think that the law, the way it's written, doesn't maybe intentionally, but it gives you an excuse to ignore invisible disabilities like dyslexia or mental health diagnoses. And it also allows disability to be a burden to a space, an afterthought, an accommodation rather than like the aesthetic of a space. And we're going to talk a little bit about an access-centered approach. We brought on last winter, Alice Shepard, and I know the Wexner did too. She hosted a talk for you all. But Alice Shepard is this wonderful dancer. She has her own dance company called Kinetic Light. And it's a dance company run entirely by individuals with disabilities. And they take this access-centered approach, which is this real, true, deep belief and practice that their disability defines their work. It's its own culture. It's not about inclusion or providing a service. It's about like disability as an aesthetic and disability practices. I also think the ADA doesn't take into account intersectional disability discrimination. Discriminations, as we know, increases and intensifies when an individual faces many biases all at once because they identify with multiple marginalized groups and they can't like pull them apart. So let's talk about that a little bit and let's unpack intersectionality in this context. And I realized I forgot to describe the last slide. It's mostly just access symbols. So an image of someone using a wheelchair, the information symbol, which is a question mark and a circle, and someone using a walking aid, the audio description symbol, the ASL symbol, which is 2 hands, and that large print symbol, which is just the word text to large print. So this is a really fun guide. If you're already familiar with it, great. Please, if you're not, I hope you enjoy it. This is a wonderful resource for you to share on your own. It's created by Miriam Dobson. And I put her information there on the screen so that you could steal it and share it with your own friends or your own organizations if it serves you well. This is just a very simplified way to explain intersectionality. So this is Bob. Bob is a blue stripy triangle, and Bob says, hi. Bob is a stripy blue triangle, already said that, and should be proud. Yay me, says Bob. Sadly, some people do not like Bob. Bob faces oppression for being a triangle and for having stripes. Bob is in the middle of the screen looking sad, and on the left of him are people holding up a sign that says down with stripes. And on the right side of him are more people holding up a bigger sign that says God hates triangles. Luckily, there are liberation groups, but they aren't often intersectional. So they look like this. There's a little a sign, like a banner that says welcome triangles, and there's multicolored triangles underneath it. And then there's a wall with barbed wire. And on the other side of that wall is another banner that says welcome stripes. And there's different kinds of shapes with stripes underneath this banner. They don't talk to each other. In fact, they compete. A yellow triangle says, I'm more oppressed. And a pink stripe circle says, no, I am. I deserve more. Now, I disagree that there aren't some intersectional liberation groups. And by this, I think she just means support groups, advocacy groups, and things, but they just aren't as common. And I think generally as society, we tend to separate these groups. We force them to compete with each other because we're more comfortable with that. Next slide. Bob can't work out where to go. Bob thinks, am I more stripe or triangle? Bob wishes that triangles and stripes could work together. A red stripe triangle says, circle says, oppression of one affects us all. And a blue triangle says, no liberation without equal representation. And a little arrow says like this, pointing down. Bob, the blue stripy triangle says, intersectionality is the belief that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be solved alone. And he's smiling. Oppressions are not isolated. Intersectionality now. So I'm thinking about disability and how it might intersect with other marginalized groups. We're really trying to set you up to think this isn't a competition to see who is most oppressed. It's in fact the opposite. And Molly came up with this wonderful metaphor of looking at intersectionality as a basket. Our identities are interwoven, layered together in like a complex pattern that lifts us and holds us all. And if we're looking at the infrastructure of beings that make our organizations tick, and considering our visitors, our programs, our policies, it does not serve us in any way to remove one of these strands from the basket or to separate the strands. Then we don't even have a basket. To remove identity is to weaken the overall integrity of the basket and create cracks that people might fall through. We all deserve to be seen and heard, of course, and to have space and support in the basket. Intersectionality is essential when it comes to considering disability. Why? Because there are lots of reasons that people don't feel welcome in cultural spaces. Systems of oppression are interconnected. Why? Because I already said many cultural spaces and programs were built for the able-bodied white upper class, and that bias just does not dissolve because there was a civil rights movement and law, because there's the ADA. Poof, it doesn't mean like people are going to be happy and welcome in our spaces. And we must consider why and be active in changing that through all that we're working towards. Disability is just one part of someone's identity that shapes them, but maybe doesn't define them. And to fully understand to what extent it's crucial to look at the whole picture of someone's identity. So this access-centered approach that I mentioned earlier, this is really access as an action, as a verb. It's considering access to include intersectional identity when you're thinking about programs, policies, growing collections, altering performances, unearthing and sharing hidden histories, hiring new folks, and providing folks with the tools and resources they need to grow as professionals. It's just really about thinking access at the beginning of everything that you do rather than the end. This is a serious mind shift, changing bias, altering system. We've all been working on this. We're all doing it all the time for so many things. I know it's super hard work and so required to change, who feels welcome in our spaces. It means letting go of the things we believe are integral to positive arts experiences. It means shifting money around to focus on different things and support different kinds of programs. And it also means keeping the following questions at the forefront of what you do. If you do this, those losses, those things that you used to consider to be so important will not carry so much weight when you lose them. So ultimately, we believe that this kind of access is beautiful. It's considering access as a superpower, and it's considering access as an aesthetic. So when you're planning, consider the following questions. Which communities are served and which aren't? Why? Who gets to participate and who doesn't? Why? Who has access to resources and support and who doesn't? Why? And which voices get heard and which don't? Why? On the image or those on the screen are those questions I just mentioned. And then also an image of about 7 little wooden pegs like you would see on a game board, perhaps. They're sitting on a wooden surface. And there's 5 or 6 little green pegs clumped together. And then there's a little blue peg that's kind of in the distance away from them, just kind of representing separation, the othering. So now we're going to turn it over to Molly, and we're going to talk about how we can represent and show up to create more supportive access-centered spaces for our organizations, whether that's in the guests and visitors, the staff that we hire, the board of directors recruit, the volunteers we have, and the art that we're putting forward. We're going to talk about doing that through marketing, hiring, recruiting, seeking, and overall building trust with the communities that we seek in our spaces. Molly, I'm going to have you take it away from here.
Thank you so much. And Megan, I'm going to rely on you to advance my slides because I don't know that I have the capacity to do that on my end.
I will.
Great. So I'm going to now switch gears a little bit. So Megan gave us a wonderful overview of the philosophy and kind of a rich history of how we got here. How did we get to this place where we are now questioning things like accessibility and pairing it up with intersectionality and trying to figure out how to make our spaces more welcoming. And I will tell you up front, my main experience is in visual arts and museums. So I don't have quite as much experience with performing arts, theater, music, dance, but we'll try to address those when I can. If you are someone who does have experience with those, and from looking at who is attending, I see some folks who definitely do. Please pop ideas, questions, feedback into the chat box for the benefit of the whole group. This first slide, I'm going to kind of go through the general departments. So when you think about a cultural organization or a business that works with the arts, there's typically like a learning department, an HR department, a finance department, development. These are all things that we're pretty familiar with. If you're a small organization like Megan and I, 2 of you sort of split those up across your staff, and maybe you get your board to help you out a little bit. But for the most part, you also sort of have those categories of work that you do every day in your organization. So whether you're big or we, like we are, these will all be familiar areas and silos of work. So the first one we're going to talk about is learning. And that's because I'm biased towards learning. That's where my background is. And my slide says learning. Don't make accessible programs, make your programs accessible. And the image on the left shows the hallway that is the Center for Creativity at the Columbus Museum of Art. At this time, it had gray walls with white boxes on one side of the hallway that have visitors' twist tie art sculptures displayed. On the other side of the hallway, it has a drawing with friends activity, which is sort of like Scrabble, but with pictures, where you draw a picture and then someone else comes along and builds off that picture. And this furniture in this hallway is low tables with low stools, and the tables are at a height that most wheelchairs are able to pull up under them comfortably so that someone who is using a wheelchair would be able to use the table. The image on the right shows the Columbus Museum of Art studio. And one of our studio associates at the time, Rachel Silva, she has a table that she has collapsed the legs on and put it down on the floor to make it accessible for smaller people, children and toddlers and young people. And there are two boys sitting on the floor creating artwork, and their mother is sitting across from them, also creating artwork. And they're all just sort of hanging out on the floor together. So when you think about your learning programs or the learning components of whatever it is that your organization does, the thing that we try to emphasize more than anything else is don't make accessible programs, meaning do not make one program that is for quote unquote able-bodied people and then a separate program that is for people who use wheelchairs. This was something that we used to encounter a lot in museum settings, where we would identify an audience that we wanted to have come into our space, basically. And so we would try to think of programming that would entice them in or draw them in. The problem with this, it seems like a good idea at first blush, that we might want to have more people of color in our space. So perhaps we do programs that would entice people of color into our space. The issue is that it becomes a little bit like separate but equal. And so it becomes almost a civil rights concern when we're thinking about having a program that is specific and separate for someone who has a disability. Rather than doing that, consider how every single program you have can be made more accessible. Some examples include, if you do artwork tours throughout your museum, consider for every single tour also having a touch tour for people who are blind or who have low sight. Not only does this increase the engagement with someone who has a visual disability, but it can also increase engagement with people who learn differently, who might have a more tactile learning style. Also, it's really cool to be able to touch education pieces. And so when you're thinking about different age ranges, kids all the way up to adults, everyone likes to be engaged with multiple senses. When it comes to things like people who might have sensory issues, consider someone who might be on the spectrum, rather than having sensory sensitive programming, which is some museums do offer. And that would sort of be the one where I'm kind of like, okay, that is one that I understand a little bit more. Instead, consider how all of your programming can be made more sensory friendly. Consider how your space could have a sensory friendly room, so that if it is a program that is not 100% sensory friendly, there is a way for a person who might be overwhelmed to excuse themselves in a way that's not obvious or glaring. And then also consider adding virtual options. This is something that Art Possible Ohio stumbled upon in the wake of COVID-19, where most of our audience had complicating health factors and were even less likely to leave their home and attend something, even after the stay-at-home order was lifted. We have found that our attendance has increased literally tenfold by having a virtual option in addition to an in-person option. So whereas before, throughout the year, we could maybe average 200 people altogether for all of our programs, we are now averaging around 2,000 people for the year for all of our programs. And that's because people with disabilities have barriers to access that a lot of times we don't consider, like transportation, access to a support person, a cityscape or landscape that is not conducive to moving around in space if you have a disability, and of course, hidden disabilities that make it difficult to be out in public. Consider if you have a severe mental illness, that if you're at home, you're able to have those supports in place that keep you feeling safe, but if you're out in public, then you're putting yourself at a certain amount of risk for a triggering event. So we are encouraging that all programs consider having a virtual component to it that allows that increase in participation. And then always consider things like ASL interpretation, closed captioning if you're doing film or theater, other ways that you can make sure that the existing program is accessible. all programs by law are required to be accommodating with 2 weeks notice. So if someone does contact you and say, I need ASL interpretation, you have 2 weeks to sort of turn that around and make sure it's available to them. So keeping that in mind in the forefront means you're not going to get surprised on the back end. So like Megan said, always sort of be planning at the top end of your experience for these accessibility concerns. When it comes to programming, slide. Exhibitions, or we can also think of this as performances. On the left hand of the screen, it shows a gallery floor. It's polished, highly polished wood, and it shows a calf height barrier, string barrier around an artwork. And then it also shows a rough sandpaper strip below that barrier. And then to the right of the screen is an image of a gallery information panel about a Columbus Comics residency artist with bulleted points. And I'll read the top 3 just to sort of highlight how the information is bulleted. About Laura Park. Laura Park is the 2017 Columbus Comics Residency Award recipient. She is the 6th artist to participate in the annual residency program. Park lived in Chicago, Illinois until the summer of 2017. She now lives in Paris, France. Park explores comics, illustration, animation, and other graphic arts, often engaging with autobiographical issues. Now, when you're thinking about exhibitions or performances, think about ways that you can present information for different learning styles and different levels of learning. So for exhibitions, one of the things that the image of the gallery floor highlights is that there is information that we need to convey about the safety of the artwork. And that information is that you cannot get too close to it. So we've done this in 2 ways. We have a barrier that is at mid-calf height, and we also have a sandpaper strip that someone who uses a cane, if they are blind, their cane would hit that strip or that barrier and indicate to them, okay, I'm at the point that I need to be at in order to stay safely away from the artwork. So it's a nice tactile, physical reminder of where that barrier is. In addition to that, most museums will have gallery guides or gallery guards stationed, and we encourage you to have those folks trained in how to address people who have disabilities should they need assistance or seem like they need to be engaged, and also to address the public in general in a way that uses humor and empathy and connects with them instead of being punitive or in some cases scary. I know I, as a young kid, had a scary experience with a gallery guard. A lot of young kids sort of are like, oh no, museum people can be scary. So making sure that there is that human element in the gallery. We also encourage people to really think hard about how they're presenting textual information. And this could be in the panels you have on the wall, as well as in programs that you hand out at an event. There tends to be a desire to put as much information as humanly possible into those panels. And we encourage you to ask yourselves, what do we actually want the visitor to take away from this? And what do we think the visitor is actually going to care about? At the end of the day, we are organizations that are designed to educate, but we're also organizations that are in a conversation with the people who we are learning with. And so to assume that people need to sort of ingest all of this information really sort of negates the information that they bring to the experience. So we encourage museums to bullet point their information to make it easier to read and digest. And we also encourage museums to use things like questions that engage and open up discussion and ask people about their experiences with an artwork or with a performance if you're using a program. It increases the likelihood that people are going to remember what you're trying to tell them. And it also increases the likelihood that they're going to feel heard and appreciated and like they're a part of the artwork and the dialogue that they're experiencing. This is probably the thing we get the most pushback on from folks. And it goes back to those questions that Megan asked earlier and sort of throwing out our preconceived notions about what we feel like people need to know. Instead, I would question, how are you showing up as an organization for the people that come to visit you? How are you allowing them to interrogate the space that you have created for them? The other thing I will say about exhibitions and performances is consider who you are exhibiting and inviting to perform in your space. So we have gotten better, certainly not perfect, over the last few years about inviting and including more people of color and more women and more people who are different and have intersectional identities into our spaces. We have all worked really hard to make these spaces more inclusive for visitors. Part of how we do that, though, is by looking at how we collect artwork in our institutions and who we decide to present as a filmmaker or a playwright or an actor or performer. Those should all represent people with disabilities. We should be collecting artists who have disabilities. We should be collecting artists who have intersectional identities, and we should be presenting the performative work of artists and choreographers and writers who have disabilities, and presenting that identity in a way that is authentic to the artists themselves. Slide. And that ties in very nicely to collections. So a lot of smaller organizations are not collecting organizations. But again, whenever we're presenting work or collecting work, we cannot change sort of that white supremacist model of the cultural organization without challenging what it values most. Because the moment a museum collects an artwork or a company adds a play or performance to its annual program, we have made a value judgment about whose art matters. So if we decide that we are going to start collecting people with identities that traditionally have been seen as other or less than, and we begin collecting and doing the research and putting in the time that a curator or an art director would put in on more traditional art forms, it raises and elevates the profile of artists with disabilities to that same level as all other artists. And it's work that has to be done. This slide has an image of a very traditional gallery at the Columbus Museum of Art. It's the salon hung Renaissance themed gallery. There's a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi in the background, as well as some smaller icon style artworks alongside of it. And in the foreground is a coloring page style standee of a woman of color with her daughter in this gallery. And the coloring page has actually been colored on by visitors. This is sort of to show the juxtaposition between our traditional artwork collecting tastes and what we've been trying to shift more towards, allowing more difference in the gallery, allowing more different identities, and inviting the visitor to also be a part of that dialogue. So consider whenever you're collecting or deciding what your sort of set program is going to be, whose opinion are you taking into account? What do your artistic directors look like? What does your board of directors look like? What does your curation staff look like? And how are they making choices about who they're going to collect and who they're going to invite into the gallery space? Slide. Human resources. So we've sort of talked about the front end of our organizations, the public facing end of it. And now let's talk a little bit about the back end and what is sort of behind the scenes in our organizations. This slide says human resources. The GDP could get a boost of up to $25 billion if just 1% more of persons with disabilities joined the US labor force. And this is from the article that I have cited at the end of the presentation and provided a link to, Getting to Equal: the Disability Inclusion Advantage from 2018 from Accenture. This quote is really powerful to me because we often think of, or there is a bias that people with disabilities are a drain on society because they receive things like Social Security and entitlements, when in actuality, people with disabilities are a economic force just like any other population. And bringing them into our workplace not only boosts our general economy, but it also boosts our organizational culture. We know from tons of research that the more diverse our organization's employee profile is, the better the work is. We have more brains with more background knowledge, more lived experience, and we are better able to serve a wider population. So it's sort of understood that most cultural organizations up until very recently have been predominantly white and predominantly middle class. And there was always a lot of question about how do we serve a wider audience. That's really difficult to do when your employee population is homogenous and you don't have the viewpoints of lots of different people in your staff and on your board. The other thing that tends to happen in museums, and I've seen this at both of the museums I've worked at, is the lower the income bracket, the more diverse. And as you move up through the hierarchy of the museum or the organization, it gets whiter and more middle class, and traditionally more male, although that has shifted to more female over the last few years. So consider what it means to hire diversely across the board, top down and bottom up. We should not just have diversity and difference in our entry level and associate level positions, but we should see it in our executive level positions, in our management level positions across the board, and in our board of directors as well, so that those different perspectives can be heard at all different levels. The other thing that this does for us is if you have buy-in at the top level when it comes to things like accessibility, diversity, and equity, it is much more likely to make it into your budget documents and into your strategic plans and have that effect across your entire organization. Slide. Facilities. This one is kind of the most obvious, and also the most difficult at the same time. A lot of us have inherited these buildings that were built in the 1930s or earlier than that. When you think of sort of the traditional Carnegie model of a museum, where it's the big grand staircase out in front and everything's marble and shiny, and you walk in and you're supposed to look upward and it's supposed to be a transcendental experience. It's great and it's transcendental for people who can walk up those stairs. But if you're someone who uses a wheelchair and has difficulty accessing a building that has a big old series of stairs, and you've been relegated to go around to the back of the building where the accessible entrance is, that is a much less transcendental experience for you. Instead, that is an experience that sort of puts you in your place very quickly. So one of the things that we talked about that I thought was really sort of sweet and charming in our conversation with Alice Shepard was about things like ramp fails, where accessibility has been added as almost an afterthought to a lot of the buildings that we occupy as cultural administrators. And so thinking about how we can rework a building so that it utilizes universal design. And the image I have on this slide is a fantastic example of that. It's the West Garden at the Columbus Museum of Art. It's a panoramic photograph, and it shows a garden space that has a walkway leading upstairs, and then flanking out to either sides of the walkway are two sloping ramp walkways. So one is a stone path, and the other is a concrete path. And both are designed to be accessible. One is a wheelchair ramp that sweeps up and around. And as you go up the ramp, you get to go by different sculptures that you would not see if you went up the walkway that leads to the stairs. And it's a beautiful example of a wheelchair, I would say, success that's built into the landscape in a way that is aesthetically pleasing and honors the landscape and architecture of the building, as well as the experience of someone who is utilizing a wheelchair. This is also true for the behind the scenes parts of your museum. So your public facing facilities use access as an aesthetic, also use it for the back end of your facilities. Your employees who have accessibility needs should be honored in the same way that your guests are. One example of this is we've been working pretty closely with the Cincinnati Art Museum, and every staff person that we've talked to, one of the number one things they say is our staff entrance is not ADA compliant. It is not accessible. And that makes us feel bad. It makes us feel bad for someone who might need to use our space, who is an employee who is not offered the same accommodation that any other employee would be offered. And it's on the short list of things that they want to fix, because what it says to a new employee is, you're welcome here, asterisk, but you got to go through a different entrance. So consider how all aspects of your cultural organization are accessible, and consider how they can be accessible in ways that are elegant and honor the experience of the individual with a disability. Slide. Marketing. This one's fun because a lot of it is stuff you could start doing today. Marketing is where we talk probably most about workflow, that in thinking about accessibility as an aesthetic, also think about how you can reprioritize, slow down, and think about your workflow differently. So in order to make accessibility an everyday thing, it has to become an everyday thing. You actually have to do the work, and marketing is a great example of how you can do that. So the slide that's before you now has a screen cap of our Instagram feed, and it has one of our artists, Regina Dorfmeyer, who is a Black woman with gray curly locks. She's wearing a limeish green shirt with a black tie, and she's holding up 2 buttons and just smiling, huge smile. And the hashtag in the post says #TakeOverTuesday, and we have camelbacked that hashtag, which means we have capitalized each beginning letter of each word, which makes it a lot easier to read. So and it also, I always like to make Megan laugh a little bit on this one. It also avoids unfortunate hashtag mishaps. Like this picture is from our Day of Arts event. So if you hashtag Day of Arts without camelbacking, you could run into a situation where someone reads it as Day of Farts, which happened to us. But if you camelback that hashtag, you capitalize each of the letters, and it's clearly Day of Arts. So you don't have that embarrassing situation. Other things you must do: add alternative text to all of your images. The way that Megan and I have been describing each of the images on our slides is exactly what you need to do. Just 1 or 2 sentences that describe the image with enough detail that you feel like someone who is using a screen reader could imagine what that image is. Use closed captioning whenever possible. Fortunately, most of our video conferencing software has closed captioning built in now. You can also get some third-party software options like Rev or Otter that will help increase your closed captioning capabilities. YouTube will do closed captioning pretty much automatically. You do have to go in and check the transcript just to make sure that it's picked up exactly what you're saying. Another way to do this is transcripts, to have just a full transcript of whatever the presentation or the video is available. And then representation is super, super important. As visual description, I missed that one, ties back into alternative text. But representation, making sure that in your marketing materials, you're showing people who are different, that there are people with disabilities in your marketing materials utilizing your offerings. We also encourage that if that's something you want to take on, build a partnership with an organization that works with artists with disabilities or people with disabilities, and invite them into your space and build a relationship with them that allows them to give constructive critical feedback on what is and is not accessible. In exchange for that, ask, can we photograph you? Can we take pictures of you utilizing the space and use it in our marketing materials? You can also hire models who have disabilities. There have been a couple companies like American Eagle Outfitters who have done great campaigns, advertising campaigns where they've used models who have disabilities. For us, it's kind of a no-brainer. Part of our mission is that we pay artists with disabilities. And so it makes total sense to us to hire a model with a disability and bring them in to do an advertising campaign. So do the work at the front end of your marketing so that people who access your marketing see that your place is a place for them. They actually see themselves in that work. Slide. Oh, and the one thing I will also say about marketing is then it's okay to be transparent about it too. If you create a member magazine, it's okay to put on the back of that member magazine, hey, just so you know, our organization is committed to accessibility. As a result of that, this member magazine uses a 12-point sans serif font. We use high contrast images, we have larger captions, and we partnered with this organization so that we could have models in our member magazine that represent intersectional identities in our community. Slap it right on there. Let people know that you're doing it and let people know that it matters to you. Development. The total disposable incomes post-tax for working age individuals with disabilities is nearly $500 billion. And this is from the article, Hidden Market Spending Power of People with Disabilities from 2018 from the American Institutes of Research. As the person in our organization who is primarily responsible for grant writing and fundraising, I see that number and that spending potential and power that comes from a population with disabilities is incredible. And for us to not create programming and make our spaces a place where people with disabilities feel like this is a place for me and this is a place where I want to contribute my dollars is not only a missed opportunity, but it's ignoring a huge segment of the population that should be a part of your daily audience. And so I would encourage your development department to think about ways that they can make development events, development marketing materials more targeted to people who have disabilities, especially considering that as people age, they're more likely to start donating. And as people age, they are more likely to have disabilities. Those things do go hand in hand. So when you're considering how you approach potential donors, having disability in mind and being able to talk about how your organization is forward thinking when it comes to accessibility and how accessibility is a superpower can be really powerful for you in leveraging those donation dollars. Next. And then transparency. This gets back to what I said about the marketing piece of it. Be upfront and honest about the things that are working for you with accessibility and the places where you've had challenges. Just like the discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the more honest we can be about these conversations, where we have shortcomings, where we are having successes, the more we share it with our colleagues, the better we will all be. I will not read this entire page. It's an article about our name change from our annual report of last year, but I will highlight what I said in the last two paragraphs about our name change and our brand identity change. So we worked with GSW Worldwide, who designed a new logo and branding that we were able to take to our website developer, WonderJam. It was essential to us that the aesthetics of our brand embody accessible design, an idea that GSW and WonderJam were excited to explore with us. Our materials utilize sans serif fonts, high contrast colors, screen reader friendly web design, thoughtful alternative text, and clean layouts and formatting. We believe that accessible design is beautiful design. So when you are looking at all of your programs, departments, your marketing materials, your development strategy, your strategic plan, be transparent about how equity, inclusion, diversity, and accessibility infiltrate every element of that work and talk about it. Talk about it with the people that it serves, talk about it with your stakeholders, your funders, everyone. The more we talk about it and the more we get it out in the open and have honest dialogues about it, the more we are going to be able to make changes for the better. Having said that, this is also work that is never done. You're never going to wake up one day and be like, I did equity and I'm all done now and I'm going to have a beer. Instead, it's going to be, man, equity was really hard today. And I either felt pretty crappy about it because I didn't do a good job, or this is a day where I feel really good about it because I made some good strides and still have that beer. So next slide. Here are our sources. And this is just a small section of a lot of the information you can find out there about accessibility. If you are looking for any kind of resource to take to your board of directors or your leadership and say, hey, this is something we need to start doing and we need to start doing better, let us know and we can help you source the numbers, the quotes, the information that you need to make it for case making. It's really important to us that that information is out there and that everyone is armed with it and ready to go and make a case for inclusivity in their space.
And I will share this slideshow with Allison so that she can share it with all of you so you can grab these links. Molly, anything else?
This is how you can get to us. I am the executive director. My email address is molly@artposible ohio.org. Please email me with any questions.
And this is mine, Megan. I'm the director of programs and it's megan@artposibleohio.org. And here's our website, www.artposibleohio.org. And I think that's what we've got for you today, folks. I don't know how much time we have for question and answer. I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes if there are any. Allison, if you have to shut it down, that's fine.
No, we can stay open. So if people have questions, I encourage you to stick around. In the meantime, I want to say, if those who want to jump off, thank you for participating in this. Again, we'll continue to try and offer free workshops once a month. This was just the beginning of our equity series, and this hour went fast, and there's so much to think about. So thank you to Molly and Megan. No, it's great. It's great stuff to make us think differently. So I appreciate all of your advice and expertise.
And we are trying to do all this stuff too. We're not good at all of the stuff that we just so y'all know.
Everybody's learning all the time.
Yeah. So jump off, but if you have questions, go ahead and stick around, and you can stick them in the chat or you can just unmute and ask.
Yes, Helen, it is a practice all day, every day.
I've actually got a quick question just to see if you have any resources specifically for when you want to be able to offer as much accessibility as possible, but you have real safety concerns with what the artist would be doing, and just what some of those resources would be. Obviously, I met you both, so I work at Glass Axis. It's a glass studio, so there's safety concerns for people who don't identify as having any disabilities. There are safety concerns, so we're just trying to really make sure we're making things as accessible as possible while still maintaining safety in the building. And any resources you could share with that would be wonderful.
Sure. I think a general rule of thumb would be, if it's a safety concern, if it's a safety concern for a quote able-bodied person, then it's a safety concern for everyone. If when you start making delineations between people with disabilities and how you're sort of going through making rules, the rules should apply to everyone and not just to a specific subset of people. And I think when it comes to things like safety, a lot of times it's case by case. I mean, glass blowing is kind of a specific, it's challenging on its own because it's dangerous. I don't know of any specific resources off the top of my head, but we can definitely do a little lit review and see if we can find anything.
Yeah, Melanie, I also was thinking too that example of the exhibit that had the calf high barrier and then kind of the strip,
Mhm.
if that was something that would be that you can apply to some of your space around your big scary fire things. I don't know what the real words are.
You're scared.
No,
I'm
that's
a
about
fan
right.
of textured tape. I love textured tape.
Right, right. And, I think sometimes we're struggling a lot with, the difference between serving our member artists who don't need any of that, but, may not need any, special safety equipment, and how they have to learn to adapt to work around those things, just trying to make it that best situation. But yeah, I will keep my ears open, if you think of anything. But yeah, I would, I'd love to do a lot more things, but we're, yeah, again, it's just the safety things that I'm scared of. But I love, Molly, what you said about, that then make it a rule for everyone. Don't make it a rule just for someone who's differently abled. So I appreciate that insight, definitely.
Yeah. Regarding font size on gallery labels, serif versus sans serif, and then readability, preferred font size. So sans serif means a font that doesn't have a little like
Really?
doobity-doos. like so like Times New Roman is a serifed font because it's got that extra detail on it. A sans serif font would be like an Arial font, a Calibri font, something that is very clean. Sans serif fonts are easier to read. The words don't jump around like they would with a serif font for someone who might have dyslexia. And if you have low sight, it's a bolder, clearer font for you to read. Megan, I don't know the font size off the top of my head for gallery. Do you remember?
I mean, because we kind of have our own policy, it's at least 12, but then if we're really being honest, we would prefer 14 for, I mean, we put out 14 for readable fonts because typically everything is in 12 already. So we know that it's not enough. And the hesitation comes from, well, then I can't put that info on there that I need to put on there. And we think that people who are creating the labels actually are creative and smart enough to figure out how to consolidate that information. And I think it's actually a fun challenge if you decide to use that lens. And then there's obviously lots of ways people can access other info, right? You can have a QR code on there that'll take you to a website. You can have booklets that you have pass out. You can have audio tours. Is that what you're trying to say, Molly?
Audio symbol.
So if someone were to ask me if they were to bring me a postcard or show me some labels, I would recommend 14.
Yeah. And when it comes to gallery labels too, consider how high you're hanging them. Standard gallery height has always been set to the average male gaze, which is much higher than like someone who uses a wheelchair or who is a woman or who's a child is comfortable with. So consider, I think give me the height again, Megan. I'm not good at the numbers.
58, but you could go lower. You could go 56.
Yeah. And then, so 58 for your eye line for an artwork, and then consider like leveling down a little bit for your gallery label as well. And then question about language and verbiage. So handicapped is not considered a positive term anymore, although it's still one of those words that like handicap parking kind of is still in the vernacular. We encourage people to use people first language, and the universally sort of accepted word is accessible parking. That's sort of the word that people go to now. And if you use that term, people are going to know what it means. But
go ahead, Molly.
So you go ahead.
I was going to say, and then of course, people who have identities, they have their own terms and labels that they're comfortable with, but you don't want to project what you think those might be onto them. So you might hear someone calling themselves a word that might make you cringe. Like sometimes people with disabilities still say they call themselves crips or say they're crippled, but that is their own word that they're using. Like we all use our own words for our own identities and how we describe ourselves. So we want to recognize that people with disabilities have their own labels for their own culture and their own identities, and then be very careful for those of us
Yeah.
and using words like accessible or identity first language, like Molly said.
And we always encourage people to interrogate why they feel the need to label in the first place. So oftentimes when we use a label like handicapped or disabled, it's because our brains like to categorize things. First of all, that's sort of like an evolutionary thing that we have. It helps us process a world of chaos, but it's also more about us than it is about them. So the other thing we encourage is if you don't need to categorize or label someone unnecessarily, then don't. If you are going to use categories and labels in things like visual description or alternative text. So for example, Megan and I both described ourselves as Caucasian. If we had not, then that sort of assumes that Caucasian is quote unquote regular, and you only need to describe your race if you are different from Caucasian. So if you have a website that has images of people with all different races and complexions, then be sure that you are identifying either all of them or none of them. So I would encourage you to identify all of them, because then that highlights that your organization sees and honors difference. But then be sure that you use terms like light-skinned, medium-toned dark-skinned, or Caucasian, or person of color. Be careful about using things like African American or Black, words that sort of have a connotation to them, because someone might not identify as African American, but that can also sort of be a catch-all that we use to describe people who are Black. So just sort of be a little cognizant of the terminology that you're using, and that you're not putting an identity on someone that they didn't ask for.
Right. Unless the artist gave you that.
Yeah. Unless the artist specifically identifies as a certain way.
Any other questions?
These are awesome questions, by the way.
Yeah, they're really good questions. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. As Molly and Megan said, I'll be following up with the PowerPoint and with the link to this recording. Thank you so much to Art Possible Ohio for what you do every day, and for helping all of us to continue to be mindful about the way we move about the world and invite people into our world. So appreciate it.
Thank you for this opportunity to hang out with you all.
Thanks.